I was once told that only those who don't want to be heroes are heroes. A person who faces danger with gusto will never be a true hero because he lacks the main requirement of heroism, overcoming fear. I agree in part. No matter how attracted we are to adventure, the unknown and risk, at some point our hearts race, our clothes sweat, and we have to decide whether to fight or flee. But the fact is that the man to whom the singular event that I am now presenting to you happened had no desire whatsoever to become a hero. And if he had realized the danger he was in, he certainly would not have become one. The man in question, Lourenço Gomez, had been given the complicated task of bringing flowers to the grave of a stranger, the mother of a friend. This friend had promised his mother, on her deathbed, that every year, on the anniversary of her death, he would bring flowers to her grave. However, that year he was seriously ill, and he had given Lourenço the task of fulfilling his promise. Lourenço hated cemeteries. He wouldn't go near a necropolis, even if it meant adding miles to his itinerary. He wouldn't even be dragged to a wake. When his own mother had died, he had left the last respects to the undertakers, and the poor woman's body had spent the night in the funeral chapel, wrapped in absolute solitude. However, given the great friendship he had for his sick colleague, who had pleaded with him in such a pleading way that he was moved, Lourenço decided to face his fear for the first and last time. His friend's mother was buried in a small town in the interior. Lourenço bought a bouquet of white roses in the capital, got into his car, and drove off. The cemetery, according to his friend's information, was just before the main entrance to the city. When he found the right road, it wasn't hard to find. However, he had wasted a lot of time getting confused on the country roads, and he crossed the gates of the place close to sunset. He kept checking his watch. His head was throbbing, nausea was churning in his stomach, and what he wanted most in the world was to quickly accomplish his mission and get away from that place that terrified him so much. However, he could not find the tomb of his friend's mother. He got lost among the tombs, increasingly frightened. As the sun sank below the horizon, his tension increased. He thought he heard mournful moans, saw shadows crawling among the mausoleums, and consequently he felt the urge to drop the flowers right there and run away, as fast as his legs would carry him. But his loyalty to his friend and the tone of desperation with which he had made him promise to fulfill his vow kept him in the cemetery, despite his growing anguish. However, what terrified him most was precisely feeling alone, the only one alive in front of the dwellings of the corpses, in front of the hiding places of the feared souls of the other world. Finally, he heard the sound of a shovel hitting the ground. He looked around and saw, in the last rays of sunlight, the figure of a gravedigger digging a grave. He took a deep breath, feeling as if the heat had returned to him, and approached the cemetery attendant, extremely relieved to have come across another living soul there. "Good afternoon, friend," he said, his voice still trembling. "I'm looking for a grave where I should lay these flowers. Could you help me?" The gravedigger stopped his work and looked at him. He asked him the name of the dead woman and pointed out precisely where she lay. Lourenço thanked him. The man replied, "You're welcome," and continued digging. Lourenço left the flowers next to the grave and left the place, walking with long, fast steps. He got into his car and headed for the city. As much as he wanted to return to the capital quickly, he was more afraid of driving at night, and he went to look for an inn where he could wait for the next day to dawn. Later, while he was eating something while sitting at the counter of the cafeteria that operated next to the small hotel where he had stayed, the attendant, a friendly young man, asked him why he was visibly upset. Lourenço, relieved to have someone to talk to about the anguish that was suffocating him, told him about his assignment and said that he had almost failed to complete it if the gravedigger had not shown him the tomb of his friend's deceased mother. "But I don't know why it took you so long to find the grave," said the young man. "The cemetery is well signposted. Didn't your friend give you the letter of the ward and the number of the tomb?" "Huh? Oh no. But it's not very well signposted at all. Excuse me, but there are no wings or tomb numbers, just the little chapels and some tombstones close to the ground." "Of course there is. Wait a minute. You're talking about the municipal cemetery, aren't you?" "How? The municipal cemetery? The one that's over there, further ahead, at the end of that street?" And he pointed in a direction. "No, young man. I mean that cemetery outside the city, about 3 miles from the main entrance, where my friend's mother has been buried for a long time." The young man turned pale, opened his eyes wide, and stared at Lourenço with visible disturbance. "So you saw the gravedigger?" he murmured. Lourenço felt himself shiver. "How?" The boy took a deep breath and said to him, "That cemetery was abandoned about 20 years ago, when the city government built the new cemetery. Well, according to what they say, the gravedigger from the old cemetery did not accept the change. First, he said he needed to stay there taking care of his dead. Then he went crazy and continued to dig graves as if the cemetery were still operating, receiving corpses. Finally, his deplorable mental state also led to physical illness. Many charitable people tried to dissuade him from his stubbornness and take him to the hospital, but he remained unyielding, digging graves in the abandoned cemetery, until one day his inert body was found by a passerby. He had died with the shovel in his hands, but they say that to this day his spirit remains in that cemetery, cleaning the graves and digging graves for the dead who never arrive. And they even say that not infrequently, when someone from this city disappears without a trace, it was the gravedigger who buried him, alive, in one of the graves he dug, to keep what he considers his cemetery functioning. Needless to say, Lourenço needed medical attention when he learned he had seen a ghost. Nor need I say that he tried very hard to find a rational explanation for what had happened. Finally, he convinced himself that it was not the gravedigger he had seen, but someone he had taken him for, perhaps someone else who had been passing through the place, paying homage to their dead, although he could not explain the fact that this someone was there precisely to dig a grave. The fact is that Lourenço eventually recovered from his fright. But he swears that he will never enter a cemetery again, and he swears so emphatically that I fear that not even after he is dead will the cement that seals his tomb be able to keep him inside the gates of a cemetery. The story of Lourenço Gomes became a kind of legend in the small town. The ghost gravedigger gained new life in the late afternoon conversations and stories told by the elders. For Lourenço, however, that was not just a story. It was a wound he preferred to keep closed. But fate has a strange way of forcing closed doors. 3 years after that event, Lourenço received an unexpected letter. It was from Eduardo, the friend to whom he had brought the flowers. The tone of the message was urgent and full of mystery. "Lourenço, I need to talk to you. Come to my house as soon as possible. There is something you need to know." Intrigued, and perhaps still guilty for having neglected the friendship in the following years, Lourenço went to Eduardo's house, now recovered from the illness that had struck him earlier. There, he found his friend dejected, with deep circles under his eyes, and an expression of uneasiness that Lourenço had never seen before. "Eduardo, what's going on? I received your letter and came as soon as I could." Eduardo hesitated for a moment, as if he was trying to find the courage to speak. "Do you remember the cemetery where my mother is buried? The old one, outside the city?" Lourenço froze. "How could I forget?" he replied, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "I'm sure you've met him, the gravedigger." Lourenço swallowed hard. "It was a mistake, Eduardo. I've told myself hundreds of times that it must be someone else." Eduardo shook his head, his eyes fixed on his friend. "It wasn't a mistake, and I can prove it." He took an old, time-worn, leather-bound diary from a drawer. This diary belonged to the gravedigger himself. Lourenço looked at the object as if it were a poisonous snake. "How did you get that?" "It was found among my mother's things. I never knew she knew it, until I read the pages." Eduardo opened the diary and began to leaf through it, stopping at a marked page. "Listen to this. Today, once again, I spoke with Mrs. Helena. Her pain is deep, but I find comfort in helping her care for the dead she loves so much. Even after she is gone, I promise that I will care for her eternal rest." Lourenço frowned. "Who is Helena?" Eduardo slammed the diary shut. "My mom." Lourenço felt a chill run up his spine. "Are you saying that your mother knew the gravedigger?" "Not only did she know him, Lourenço, she knew his secret. She knew why he remained in the cemetery even after everyone else had abandoned him." Lourenço couldn't form words, but Eduardo continued. The diary mentioned something about keeping one last treasure. My mother left clues, Lourenço. I think she knew you would find it that day. She believed you were the key to finding out what really happened in that cemetery. Despite the terror growing inside him, Lourenço realized that there was no escaping his fate. What are you suggesting, Eduardo? We need to go back there, Lourenço. To the cemetery. The gravedigger left something to be found. Something that can explain everything. And so, against his will, Lourenço found himself again in front of the rusty gates of the abandoned cemetery. But this time, he was not alone. Eduardo held the diary tightly as the two of them walked through the entrance. What exactly are we looking for? Lourenço asked, his voice breaking. Eduardo pointed to a passage in the diary. It says here that the treasure is buried in the first grave I dug for the living. We need to find that grave. Lourenço shuddered when he heard for the living. Do you think he buried someone alive? That's what we're going to find out. As they walked among the moss-covered tombs, a strange feeling of being watched came over Lourenço. The wind blew with an unsettling howl and shadows seemed to dance around him. Finally, they came to a grave with no headstone, just a weathered wooden cross. Eduardo knelt down and began to dig with his hands, while Lourenço watched, trying not to succumb to fear. After minutes that seemed like hours, Eduardo stopped. I found something. He pulled a small chest from the ground, covered in rust and mud. Lourenço stood frozen as Eduardo carefully opened it. Inside, there was more than just papers. There was a locket with a photo, a map, and a key. But before they could examine the items, a low, hoarse voice echoed behind them. You shouldn't be here. Lourenço and Eduardo turned around sharply, only to find a familiar figure, the gravedigger with his shovel in his hands and his eyes empty as death itself. Eduardo froze when he saw the gravedigger, but Lourenço, overcome by paralyzing fear, could only murmur, This can't be happening. You died. The gravedigger stepped forward, his shovel dragging across the ground. His voice sounded like the whisper of dry leaves being crushed. Yes, I died, but there are things that not even death can erase. Eduardo, still holding the chest, tried to argue. We just want answers. My mother knew you. She left this diary. We need to know the truth. The gravedigger tilted his head as if pondering for a moment. Then he pointed to the medallion Edward held. The truth is there. She knew too much, and you, boy, have inherited her curse. Lourenço tried to take a step back, but he tripped over a root and fell sitting down. Damn, what do you mean by that? The gravedigger ignored the question and extended his hand to Eduardo. Give me the chest, it doesn't belong to you. Eduardo hesitated. Not until we know what it means. Before he could react, the gravedigger raised his shovel and stabbed it into the ground with force as if summoning something. The air around him seemed to compress and a deep darkness began to spread across the cemetery. Lourenço shouted, Eduardo, run! But Eduardo didn't move. We can't run away from this, Lourenço. It's bigger than us. The ground began to shake, and around them, cadaverous hands began to emerge from the earth. Eduardo looked at Lourenço, tears in his eyes. Take this. He threw the medallion to Lourenço. Go now. And you? Lourenço shouted, desperate. Eduardo didn't answer. He turned to the gravedigger and held the chest tightly. If you want that, you'll have to take me with you. The gravedigger smiled, a hollow, icy smile. As you wish. Before Lourenço could intervene, a pale, disfigured hand grabbed Eduardo by the ankle and pulled him to the ground. He struggled, but it was as if the earth were devouring him. Lourenço, go away. Lourenço hesitated, but fear took over. He grabbed the medallion and ran, without looking back, while Eduardo's screams echoed through the cemetery. Days later, Lourenço was found wandering the road, in a state of shock. He was unable to explain to the police what had happened. All he had was the medallion, which he was holding so tightly that his hands were injured. When he returned to the city, He learned that no one had ever found the abandoned cemetery again. It was as if it had disappeared. Eduardo was also never seen. Lourenço spent the rest of his life haunted by the events of that night. The medallion remained with him, as a constant reminder of his failure to save his friend. In the end, Lourenço became a lonely man, unable to sleep at night, haunted by nightmares of hands rising from the earth and a gravedigger with empty eyes. When he died years later, his body was buried in a small local cemetery. But they say that sometimes at night, you can hear the sound of a shovel hitting the earth near his tomb, and the sound of shuffling footsteps that never go away.